People who make their living out of cleaning murder scenes, accidents, and the like, what is the worst thing you have experienced in your career? Hey guys, I just wanted to put a trigger warning real quick that this video talks about a decent amount of gore and hard topics like suicide. Take care of yourselves, and if this isn't the video for you, we will see you at the next one. Story 1. Obligatory, not a cleanup pro, but working at a county animal shelter means we got the roadkill remains. We were required to hold them in our facility's body freezer for a certain number of days, in case someone came in looking for a pet matching the description. This, of course, meant you had to try and come up with identifying information from whatever was left of the animal. Sometimes it was easy. They were just a bit bloodied or twisted. But other times you had to double glove, put on the apron, and start folding the bits around to try and tell what color it used to be. The worst part was when someone came in looking for a pet that matched a DOA description. Whoever happened to answer the call from the front desk had to go get it out of the freezer and tried to arrange it in such a way that the person could identify it without passing out or vomiting. We were legit trained to handle if someone passed out or puked. Luckily, it never happened to me, but we had a chair and a stretcher just in case. The hardest part was when people tried to act all tough, like it was no big deal, but then absolutely melting down. One in particular really haunts me. Pretty typical case of cat fecal, leg and rib bones sticking out, so much blood we have to towel it down to check for markings, eyeballs hanging out, and one of them is deflated and shriveled, guts hanging out the anus, just a mess. Lo and behold, the poor thing had a collar and microchip. I ended up being the one to respond when the owner arrived, and they explained the situation. Big, muscly dude wearing a Marine Corps t-shirt, tats up and down his arms. He's shaking like a leaf and trying to hide it when I come up to get him and take him back. I had this spiel I used to give about how we do this just to be sure, and sometimes it's hard to see animals like this, and just let me know if he needs to step out for a second. He tells me point blank that he's a veteran. He's seen guys get shot, he can handle it. We go into the room where I have the half-frozen cat corpse under a towel, the bloody collar on top of it. He picks up the collar without a word, and I can see in his eyes that he knows. I ask if he wants to head back up front now, and he says he has to be sure. So I pulled the towel back carefully to expose just the top half, but the poor thing was in bad shape. The good side is facing up, but its jaw is still shattered and hanging funny. The one eye is bulging out and filled with blood, like a demented snow globe. Half the tongue is missing. There's a clear depression on the chest from the tire. One leg is twisted around like a dang twizzle. The guy just stares. After a few seconds, he just turns for the door, stops halfway there, looks back, and takes a knee like someone hit him in the gut. All he says is, "I saw my guys get shot. Why a cat? It's just a cat, man. It's just a cat." The whole time, he's clutching the bloody collar to his chest. It turned out, per the girls up front who had talked to him at first, that it was the cat his therapist had recommended he get for his PTSD. Her name was Hope. This story is just heartbreaking. I lost my cat a couple months ago due to his kidneys being deformed since birth, but that didn't make it easier to watch him get sick and pass. I really hope this man was able to heal afterwards and get the help he needed, especially considering how much he loved his cat. Guys, please make sure to check the roads when you drive. You never know what animals are walking about. Story 2. Cop was first on scene to a pretty bad suicide. Midday in the parking lot, a guy smashes an entire handle of vodka sitting alone in his car, proceeds to take out a box cutter and cut from his shoulder to his wrist, but real deep, then proceeded to slash deep into his neck from side to side. I just happened to be patrolling through the area, and I saw a couple people running up to him. Right after he did it, he popped his car door open and slumped onto the ground. He was still alive, and I immediately called for an ambulance. I started to tourniquet his arm, but I knew it was just for show for the bystanders. The amount of blood on the ground meant that there was no saving him. He made a lot of sound, but nothing after a few seconds. He officially coded in the back of the ambulance. Only one other bad one that stuck with me was showing up second to a body that was pulled out of the river after 3 days. Guy was a bridge jumper and washed up on the shore with his eyes eaten out and completely bloated. I had to sit next to the body for hours in the summer heat, waiting for the medical examiner. Bonus edit, hot July, there's a car parked on the backside of a Walmart tucked in the corner of the lot. Young male, 20 years old, died inside the car. He pretty much baked inside for about 4 days before anyone thought to check on the vehicle. I never got the story. on how exactly he died, but I do remember he wasn't from the area. He had IDs, and his parents from a few states over were contacted. On the day his parents came, I was tasked with escorting them to the medical examiner's office. The ME unzipped the bag in front of them, and even in that cold room, the pungent smell slammed me. The mother covered her face with both hands and immediately started crying. Then I watched in disbelief as she leaned in and kissed his face. I can never imagine the horror of having to ID your child, but the image of her kissing that decayed body will never leave my mind. A mother's love really knows no bounds, I guess. On a side note, please reach out for help if you need it, guys. You do matter, even if it doesn't always feel like it. Someone cares about you and needs you here. Story 3. I'm a nurse. She died on a day shift and was put on my assignment for the night, so the family could take their time with the body, and I'd handle her after they left. I never knew her when she was alive. She was in her 30s, African-American, riddled with cancer. She was wearing a yellow nightgown. The day shift nurse had left her in a sitting position, all propped up with pillows. We try to make them look nice while the family says goodbye. If you've ever worked in American hospitals, you know Black families take longer with the body than white families. Everyone needs to have their private time alone with the deceased before they go to the morgue and the funeral home. Our window is 4 hours. After that, the body has to go to the morgue. But when it's important to the family and more people are hearing the news and coming to see them, we fudge the time. Hard to tell a grieving person no. So we get through shift change and the last of the family leaves. I go to get her ready to be bagged. I start lowering the head of the bed, pulling out the pillows, and this toxic smelling yellow fluid starts pouring out of every orifice, like gushing out, running over the side of the bed, puddling on the floor. If you've ever smelled really advanced cancer, you know it smells evil. It's indescribable, and there's liters and liters of it. I'll never forget that smell. I went and got a friend, apologized to him in advance. We grabbed towels and biohazard bags and shoe covers. Had to cut her nightie off and scrub the whole bed with bleach wipes just to get her clean enough for the body bag. I like telling horror stories to new nurses, but I never tell them that one. It was too awful. I am just so thankful that that stuff stayed inside her till her family was gone. Whatever you believe in, that was definitely an act of something to make it so that her body remained as normal as it could while her family was there. I couldn't imagine saying goodbye to a loved one and seeing that. Story 4. Not me, but my mother was a firefighter and EMT for a long time. She always told me some crazy stories. There are 2 that have always stuck with me. The first, 2 men whose families didn't accept their relationship, and it weighed on them so badly that they decided to take their own lives. They attempted this by getting in a tub, taking some drugs, and then using a power saw to saw off each other's arms and bleed out. The direction they cut, however, didn't make them bleed out as they had wished, and they were left with one arm uncut and no arm to cut it. My mother told me it was such a bizarre scene to walk in on that she still doesn't believe it was real. The second, they responded to a death a few days after a man had died in his hot tub, multiple days in the extremely hot water. When my mother and her partner went to pull him out, he had basically boiled alive, and all the meat on his body just slid off the bone. Edit, thanks for the awards. Bonus story for you. My mother once ran a call where a man had died in his house and wasn't found until a few days later. When she and her crew arrived, they had found that the man's cats, having been without food for days, ended up eating the man. With us having cats, the sight of a man whose face had been devoured by blood-soaked cats just absolutely freaked her out. Story 5. I'm a first responder. A few days ago, I had a bad one. Not the worst or the grossest, but it was rough. I had a wellness check in an at-risk community apartment building. There was a younger lady, terminally ill, living on her own. Her son was calling for her help and getting in contact with her. I spoke with security, and they had a key to her place, so I made entry into a dark apartment. I was navigating by flashlight. I wasn't expecting to find anyone because her neighbors told me she was in the hospital. The bathroom was covered in bodily fluids that had solidified. I found more dried human waste on the floor leading to the bedroom. I found the female on the floor in the kitchen sitting up in the dark with my flashlight. Honestly, it was something out of a horror film. I felt so horrible for her, dying alone in her pajamas, so ill. Her head was slumped down with fluids that had dripped out of her and solidified, almost frozen like icicles. She'd been dead for a few days. That image of seeing her has just stuck with me. The loneliness of the deceased situation is what makes this so horrible to me. No one deserves to die like that. Edit, I didn't expect this to blow up. I'm incredibly grateful for the messages and the replies. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. Story 6. Obligatory, not me, but my mom. She worked in maintenance at an apartment complex, cleaning and disinfecting vacated apartments and getting them ready for new tenants. On one occasion, she was asked to clean one where the previous tenant had died. She wasn't told how. The young woman had killed herself in the bathroom. The property manager insisted that my mom clean the apartment with the security guard present. Unbeknownst to my mom, 2 other cleaning ladies had already attempted to clean the room and had noped out. My mom said the atmosphere in the apartment was heavy. They left the front door open and had opened the blinds, and even so, with the afternoon light spilling in, the apartment just seemed dark and again heavy. My mom cleaned quickly and efficiently, starting from the back bedroom and working her way out the front door. When she was in the hallway, across from the only bathroom in the apartment, the one where the girl had killed herself, she felt the darkness deepen, and a horrible sense of dread overwhelmed her. She couldn't make herself go into the room and clean the rest of the apartment instead. She told the property manager she cleaned everything but that bathroom. The property manager ended up doing it herself, and my mom said she quit soon after. For anyone from the Houston area, these were some apartments in the Greenspoint area, and this was back in the 90s. So I decided to look up the area just to see what OP was talking about, and it turns out the crime rate for this area is 41%, which is extremely high. I don't blame OP's mom for not going in that room. I don't think I could have either. Story 7. Not me personally, but my dad used to be an EMT and firefighter. In the late 80s, he got a call about a horrid smell coming from the neighbor's house of the person calling. EMT, firefighter, and police were dispatched. They found the house was owned by a single old lady who died in her living room chair. Not too bad, right? Wrong. The chair was an old leather recliner, and as she was decomposing, she melted and fused with the leather chair. When the EMTs got there, they had to remove her from the house. And when they tried to pull her off her back, skin, arms, and lower body separated from the rest of her body and remained attached to the chair. Decomposing flesh, blood, and organs fell out and all over the chair and floor. People were vomiting every 10 seconds and couldn't stand to be inside longer than a few minutes. My dad describes the smell and scene as the worst thing he has ever seen. Her body was so decomposed, she was basically liquid inside with a fragile shell. He had to leave and grab a full respirator from the fire truck. And even then, it didn't do jack. The others took turns going in to retrieve the pieces so they can be disposed of. When they were finished, they burned the chair in the front yard. Story 8. Not a cleaner, but my brother's best friend is a police officer, and I heard all about this horrible experience. My brother's friend took him on a ride-along all the time. One day, they were responding to a welfare check. This guy's neighbors saw his apartment door cracked open for several days and called the police. They went to check it out and found a college student, aged 18 to 19, who had shot himself. The most disturbing part to my brother was that the kid had all of his belongings boxed up and labeled. He had his letters written out and labeled for who they were supposed to go to, and even went as far as laying out a tarp, and then putting heavy blankets over himself before he shot himself. It's a courtesy to the people that would have to clean his remains. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a very well-thought-out suicide. And the guy was obviously thinking about everyone who would have to deal with it too. So sad to imagine such a thoughtful person in so much pain that he meticulously orchestrated his suicide. My brother said the scene messed him up, not because of the gore, but the lack thereof, because this guy so meticulously and thoughtfully offed himself. Story 9. One that stuck with me was a suicide in a bathtub. We couldn't drain the tub, so we had to use a coagulant, then scoop up the bloody mess into biohazard bags. Same for the toilet. Another was a suicide by gun in a basement full of boxes, which was a nightmare to clean, as even the smallest bit of flesh had to be found and cleaned up. The smell of the smallest piece of flesh meant the job wasn't done until it was found. One scene, the cops thought it would be helpful to put newspaper on top of the leftover melted body oils, which dried to the floor and was terrible to clean up. Sad cleaning up these things when the family's in the other room as well. Not working the job anymore, but definitely gave me an appreciation for the hard work biohazard cleanup crews do. Mostly on call as well, so you never know how long you'll be away from home. Edit. Another one that wasn't as gross, but felt straight out of a horror movie. Trailer where the person had squished what had to be thousands of pantry moths onto every wall. Living in pure filth. Had to have a mental condition. Just really sad. Reading through these stories definitely gives me a huge amount of respect for these people. who have to do these jobs. Truly unspoken heroes. I know that sometimes cleaning up the ambulance I work on can be a bit of a pain, but it seems like nothing after reading some of these. Story 10. My ex was a funeral director. The two that stuck out semi, who turned in front of a crotch rocket. He even said with the helmet on, the guy's head just exploded. He said you try to pick up the big parts, but you were mostly shoveling goo into garbage bags. Not a murder, but the old man who had a heart attack outside by the campfire alone. No one checked on him for so long. By the time they found him, everything but his one foot was completely burned up. Fun bonus story. He had keys to the cemetery and would take me to the crematorium at night. The tour was weird. He showed me a bucket full of the metal parts left after a cremation, hip, knee replacements, etc. And he made me stand to the side while he opened the oven to see if they were done, and you don't want to see this. He just opened it a couple inches, was like, nope, needs more time. Like he was checking a pizza. He was weird. Edit, thanks friends. Sorry for my Canadian slang. Semi 18-wheeler hauling goods. Crotch rocket, those plastic-looking motorcycles you ride hunched over that go really fast. Story 11. A friend of mine was an EMT for roughly 10 years. Her most gruesome scene was a group of friends who couldn't have been older than 21, had been snowmobiling in the rural Midwest. She'd been told they were going through an area with significant tree coverage when all of a sudden, one of the boys had crashed. Turns out someone had strung steel wire between trees, most likely deliberately to deter or injure. And the wire had caught the kid square across the neck. It was an immediate internal decapitation and his head flopped completely backward. She said when they went to move him, you could feel the sharp break and hear the bones through the skin when they tried to lay him down. The call that made her quit was a house fire where firemen pulled a toddler out of the house, deceased and burned so badly. Her clothes had burned and melted into her skin. The fused pajamas were the same pajamas my friend had for her own daughter of a similar age. She went home immediately, threw out her daughter's matching pajamas, and quit later that week. Story 12. Not any associated profession, but I did see a gnarly accident that I helped with when I was in elementary school. So this guy was doing tricks on his motorcycle while speeding without a helmet and hit a pothole or something like that. Anyway, dude smashed his head on the street so hard it scattered for nearly 2 blocks. My mom drives by and sees my dad on the scene of this gnarly accident, so she pulls over for a visit and I see the body as it's being covered. Literally, just the body, neck down. Dad couldn't make mom take us home, so he went into teaching mode to avoid traumatizing us and had my bro and me search for headpieces. I found a bit of scalp, but the human brain has a very distinctive smell. Mostly sniffed those out and signaled someone with gloves on to avoid touching hazmat. He picked them up and flicked them into a trash bag like a booger. Everyone did their best, but Dad drove by later, and cats were taking care of the missed pieces. Story 13. I work in disaster cleanup, including biohazard scenes. Sadly, it's only gotten worse since the Rona. Suicides have spiked, murder is up, old folks dying at home alone, and people not realizing for longer because they don't want to give grandma and grandpa the virus. You would think they'd still pick up the phone and call. They are all awful. From the man who murdered his mom with a weight, to the man who shot himself in the head, then walked all around the house bleeding everywhere, to the man who shot himself and we had to scrub blood off the baby bassinet, to the old man who died in a senior independent living facility, who had no furniture and just a sleeping bag on the ground with garbage and feces stains everywhere. He wasn't found for some time. That one really bothered me a lot. Seeing someone who lived in those conditions and no one knew, or maybe didn't care, or they didn't realize he was gone until the odor got too bad. Please make sure you call your loved ones, guys. I know after my grandma passed, my grandpa really let the house go, just because he was overcome with grief, and I can't blame him for that at all. That being said, it was a pain to clean the house after he moved, just because it had gotten so bad. Story 14. I spent some time with the coroner to shadow for school. They were showing me different cases and going over them, pictures included. The one that seemed to emotionally bother this particular guy the most was a scene where a father was coming home and pulling into the driveway. His daughter, 3 years old, was running to greet him, and he didn't see her, and ended up running over her head. The pictures were heartbreaking enough. I can't imagine what the dad went through when he saw her like that. There was another one that had 3 bodies. Some guy killed his wife, his affair partner, and her daughter, put them in a shed in the middle of summer and left town. They were found 3 weeks later, basically piles of putrid slime. maggots, like filled 10-gallon buckets full, and bloated body parts slawing off as they tried to bag them. The murderer had a pilot's license and has never been caught. The decomp room smelled for months after that. Story 15. I had a friend who worked in homicide investigations one summer. This is the worst story I heard. My college town was a city down south where much of the residents live in substandard situations, comparable to developing nations. A lot of drugs, weapons, people, and other contraband was trafficked through here, as it was a crossroads for both the interstate system and railroads. The towns involved were extremely violent and had many addicts themselves. One day in mid-July, his unit received a call reporting a horrid smell coming from an abandoned house. Turns out a crew had been involved in a gunfight, and the survivors brought the deceased corpses back to the house and tried to mummify the bodies. For 4 weeks while high on crack, PCP, meth, and/or others, they performed voodoo rituals to try to resurrect the departed while in their drug-induced psychosis. Keep in mind this was in the dead of summer, in the armpit of the South, with daily average temps in excess of 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Story 16. Cleanup after murder. It was a rehab house for ex-cons, a 4-bedroom house with communal bathroom and kitchen. Sunday morning, and Guy A is in his room listening to music pretty loud. Guy B is in the kitchen cooking his breakfast. B knocks on A's door and tells him to turn it down. There's a small argument, and B returns to his breakfast, and A turns his music up. So, B grabs the biggest knife in the kitchen, kicks in A's door, and stabs him through his left shoulder, entering by his collarbone. A runs out of his room, across the landing, down the stairs, out the front door, back inside, back up the stairs, and collapses on the landing. When I got there, it was like a scene from a movie. Walls and ceilings everywhere A had been were caked with blood. Apparently, after B stabbed him, he returned to cooking his breakfast. There was a half-eaten breakfast in the kitchen when I got there. I can't imagine stabbing or hurting someone and then just casually going back to my Eggs Benedict like nothing happened. Story 17. I'm not a crime scene cleaner, but we used to transport coroner cases as part of our job. The elderly man who blew his head off with a shotgun in a 3rd-story attic in the summer was rough. He'd been there a few weeks. We could smell him when we got out of the truck on the street. Blood spatter covered every inch of the walls in that room, as did the flies. Had to scrape some dried brains off the floor into a container for the coroner. When I went to roll him into a body bag, his bloated, slimy greenish-blue skin slipped off of him, and I was left holding a large sheet of it with both hands. The worst part was his wife had passed away a few weeks before. They had been one of those married for 60 years, inseparable couples. He just couldn't take it. That broke my heart. Other guys were puking. I cried silently. Story 18. So my brother does biohazard cleanup jobs. A few weeks ago, he got a call to clean up a suicide, and that it was going to be a particularly messy job, as the guy was a 280-pound ex-football player, blew his brains out on the front porch. That's how he found his brother-in-law died. Of course, nobody else could do the cleanup for some reason. There's more messed up details, but I can't remember them all. Something about a family member going in and getting wasted on alcohol while the body was still wet. Edit. To add, it really messed with my brother-in-law. I think the two of them had gotten pretty close. This wasn't his first experienced suicide of a family member either. Also, I call him my brother, but he's technically my brother-in-law, and we are close. We've been friends for a long time. It would just be confusing to say my brother-in-law's brother-in-law died. Story 19. I had a great uncle who helped clean up the bodies left behind by Hurricane Audrey in 1957, and he said that the smell persisted in his nose for weeks after. It got so bad that when he went to the doctor to see if they could do anything, and they clipped all of his nose hairs, and the smell went away. It was explained to him that the smell had soaked into the hair, but I don't claim to know the validity of that statement. The hurricane hit South Louisiana in June of that year, and most of the bodies recovered were found in the saltwater marshes that cover the area, so it's safe to assume that they were in advanced state of decay. I've heard it said that the smell of the decomposing bodies was so bad that the alligators would actively avoid the areas, but I don't know the validity of that either. This is actually a really interesting fact. Maybe not the best in this setting, but that's why people tell students to wear masks when working with formaldehyde, because the smell is so potent and can get trapped in your nose hair. Story 20. Story from my father, a former cop. But it's kind of relevant. He had to sit in on a grotesque scene while they waited for whatever was the CSI equivalent in the 80s. The crime scene involved a 20-year-old son shooting his dad in the head, then his mom, then himself. My dad had just transferred to the department, So as a way of hazing the new guy, the other officers made him watch over the bloodbath in the dining room to make sure that no one would disturb it. My dad had to wait for like a half hour in front of 3 fresh corpses. He said that the father of the killer had a hole through his head, and you could see parts of brain on the wall. Then, in an attempt to get my dad to vomit, they had someone grab dinner for everyone at Wiener Schnitzel, a bunch of gooey, messy chili dogs. Story 21. So I'm not a crime scene cleanup person, but I did work for a coroner's office for a while. I've spoken about it before on Reddit. This one time we went to process a scene where a guy died in his apartment, and he wasn't found for 4 days, and the heat got up to 100 Fahrenheit while he was in his apartment. Needless to say, he had started to decompose. We were putting his body in the body bag, and I grabbed his ankles while my partner grabbed his wrist. We go to lift him up, and the skin around his ankles sloughs off while I'm trying to lift him. Had to adjust my grip and get him into the bag. Meanwhile, my partner, like a dum-dum, is breathing through his nose and gagging every 3 seconds. It was hilarious. I have another story too. Maybe I'll save it for another post. Story 22. Not a first responder, but this is probably the only place I can tell this story with context. It was about 4 or so years ago Christmas Day, and my mother, 3 little siblings between 8 and 11 at the time, and I were taking the train to the city. Now, because of my wheelchair, we got seated in the second car of the train. That being said, the conductor left the door to the cockpit open, so my brother could see all the buttons and levers. He had a thing for trains. It was about 30 minutes into the journey, and I was looking out the cockpit windows, and at this point, I saw a man jump from a bridge above the tracks, and it was like a human slushy hitting a windshield. I will never forget that. What was worse was the smell, believe it or not. Worst Christmas ever. Story 23. Ex-paramedic student here, and not my story, but my paramedic teacher told me about her first ride out to a car wreck, where a guy in a convertible was high as a kite and thought going 60 miles per hour on a highway that he could drive his convertible underneath a semi-18-wheeler. When my teacher arrived on scene, she was stepping off the bus when a bunch of people yelled at her to freeze. She stopped mid-step and looked down. The guy's head, from getting decapitated, was right under her foot, and she nearly stepped on it. Bonus story, at certain speeds, if you get into a wreck, your body just liquefies. I remember one particular training session where the body of a motorcyclist was reduced to nothing, but a rubber skin suit wrapped tightly around a pole. Well, at least she didn't have to buy a new pair of shoes. It is super interesting, though, that if you go fast enough, your body just loses its solid state of matter and becomes liquid. Story 24. A family friend was a first responder to a scene where a young woman committed suicide by running onto a busy highway at night. A semi-truck hit her, and essentially her body exploded. He described the scene of just picking up pieces scattered across the road and the shoulder. Edit, this got more attention than expected. The poor driver of the truck thought he'd hit a deer and didn't know it was a person until he saw this tattered clothing on the road. This happened probably 12 years ago. The story stuck with me because of how cavalier he spoke about it. Sadly, this wasn't the worst call he'd ever had, and there were a few he refused to speak about. Story 25. Obligatory, not who was being asked, but was a property manager for a while. Had a call one midsummer Friday morning about flies. I hope blank isn't dead, I thought. A few hours later, another tenant called about the same thing. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, I found out he had hung himself on the indoor communal staircase. All the other tenants used the outdoor stairs to access their apartments. The property owners refused proper cleanup because they wanted to preserve the flooring that had been soured by 4 days of decomposition in mid-Atlantic heat. I went in on Monday after the air scrubbers had been going for about 36 hours. It smelled like cheese pizza. I will never forget that smell. Story 26. I worked for a restoration company that rarely cleaned up after dead bodies, and I got the only one during my tenure at the company. The lady had passed probably 2 weeks before anyone did a wellness check, so the entire room was contaminated. By the time I got there to do the cleaning, there were so many dead flies and maggots on the floor. It was truly shocking. We rolled the carpet and carpet pad up that was in the room, and all of the dead bugs sounded like a rain stick you get in a cheap tourist shop. That sound sticks with me after 3 years. Ugh, I absolutely hate bugs. So the idea of seeing a huge group of them like that gives me the heebie-jeebies just sitting here. Story 27. Not exactly what you asked, but my husband's uncle worked as a paramedic and firefighter for many years. The accident that disturbed him the most, warning, this involves children, was getting a call about 3 boys locked in the trunk of a car. From what I can remember, the kids were playing around outside during the summer, and had gotten into an old, non-running car on someone's property. He had to pry the trunk open, and unfortunately, all three had passed. He said that day took a lot out of him, and he still can't get the images out of his head. Story 28. One of my first jobs after moving, I did this, and the job that had me walking wasn't even as scene as described. We did all types of hazmat cleans, and the worst was actually a couple went on vacation and came back to backed up septic. Think about 1 foot thick, hard, dried out, crusty septic waste spread through the entire first floor of a house. Not going further into detail here, was nasty. Septic, not skeptic. On break and mobile, so yeah. Story 29. Not me, but an acquaintance is an EMT. He responded to a suicide where the guy decided to kill himself by running headfirst into a spinning table saw. The guy ran face first into the blade, but didn't die. They could tell by the blood trail that he had to take a second run at it to finish the job. He told me he didn't think that much blood could come out of a single person. They likely had to rip the walls down to the studs to get rid of all the blood. The saw sent it flying everywhere. Story 30. IICRC TSCT OCT here. While most days are somewhat normal, I remember a gentleman passed away on his toilet a few months prior to being found. I got the call to head over as the local authorities had released the scene, begun cleanup, and gutted the inside for renovation. As I am heading up the stairs to begin cleanup, the downstairs neighbor lady asks if I am the plumber, there to fix the water leak above her unit. She lived below the where the deceased man I was cleaning up lived. Okay, it's bad enough to have a leak in your apartment. Add to the fact that the leak is coming from a dead guy's apartment where the person was decomposing, and a whole myriad of liquids are probably coming out. I think I'd just move right then and there. Story 31. Dad had to saran wrap a guy's intestines back into his body once. Dude had surgery and pushed too hard on the toilet. Dude was fine, according to Dad, just holding himself together on the toilet while a group of firefighters tried to figure out why they were sent instead of paramedics. Update, when he pushed too hard, he opened a scar on his torso and ab area, and it all fell out onto his lap. Should have mentioned this when I wrote the post. Story 32. Not our main cleaner, nor is this my story. This was my dad's friend's friend. The guy's father killed himself with a shotgun. The father shot himself inside while all the family were outside playing. Due to the family not having money or the lack of life insurance policy the father had, they could not afford a cleaner. So the kids and the mother had to clean up the father's remains inside the house themselves. Story 33. I work in the ER. I was told by someone that works for a funeral home that they had to go get a girl that had overdosed and passed away. They said she had her breasts augmented and was pregnant. Turns out she overdosed while taking a bath and had decomposed enough that her breast implants and the fetus were floating around in the water. Then I clocked out and had lunch. Story 34. When I was a bartender, a couple of clients told me the worst part about the job is cleaning melted bodies. I don't know the science behind that, but from what I understand is if a body stays for a while in a certain condition of temperature and humidity, it melts. And those guys have to remove that person's remains in buckets. Story 35. So I have two. I'm an aircraft rescue firefighter. When I was in the Marines, we were in Thailand with some F-16s, and one decided to smack the ground during a gun run training. No time to eject. During recovery, we were told to pick up any pieces of the pilot we found and put in a bucket. I found his cheek and eyebrow. Story 36. I am a cop. Fatal accidents are the most gruesome. I saw a father holding onto his dead son screaming. His son wasn't technically dead, but he was ejected from a car and hit a brick wall headfirst. The son died within minutes. Mom was dead. Son was 10. Dad was soaked in his blood. Story 37. My ex-partner's cousin used to do this. According to what I heard, someone committed suicide from the 24th floor, and she had to chip frozen brain matter off the railings leading into the building. Also how she met her husband. They both were working the same job. Story 38. My friend described a scene where a guy committed suicide via shotgun in the mouth. Neighbor called the police. When they arrived, they found thousands of pedophilic images and 30-plus bloody child-sized panties. They never matched the DNA to the underwear. Geez, this story took a much darker turn. I don't know if I should feel bad or what, but it is certainly making me feel something. Story 39. Medicare. First responder to a motorcycle collision. Guy who crashed was a friend. He'd been torn in half and almost decapitated. Had to walk away from the scene and let my driver and another crew handle it. Think about it daily. Story 40. I don't do cleanup, but the other day I had to do CPR on a guy who bled to death out of his nose. Something about it being a nosebleed was really disturbing to me, looking at his blood-covered face while doing compressions. Story 41. I am so terrified of bothering anyone that as I read all these, I kept thinking stupid things like, I hope when I die I turn the AC up really high, so I don't turn too much into goo for other people to clean up. Same, OP, same. Story 42. My buddy picked up bodies and was immune to it until he had to pick up the body of a child who died of cancer. He said that the cries of the parents were too much for him. He quit the next day. Story 43. Friend of mine does this. His worst was an elderly woman who died in a bath. Skin falls off like long-cooked meat, so he just saw piles of skin and flesh. Just writing this makes me gag. Story 44. Teen girls had to be pieced back together. Steering column went through her chest like a straw through a slice of cheese. Had to put the hamburger heart back together. Very weird way to describe what was probably a major surgery, but I'm happy the girls were okay. Story 45. I have a carpenter. I followed up with a cleanup where the body decayed and leaked through the floor, into and through the ceiling below. Everything was torn out and replaced. Story 46. My mother used to clean up house fires and dead bodies. She did clean up her boyfriend's brains after he killed himself with a shotgun. Story 47. A cousin committed suicide and the crew left a tooth behind, to which his 5-year-old son found and kept until his mother became aware.
Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.